Because previously Nauru had enjoyed such a fantastically high standard of living, there were very, very generous welfare provisions. There's no, then as now, there's no taxation. And there wasn't really a compunction to work if people didn't want to. Much of the heavy work on the mines was done by foreign labour brought in from neighbouring Pacific states like Tuvalu and Kiribati, and much of the skilled work was done by Australians. So at the moment, after the decline of the phosphate during the 1990s, there's the situation where many Nauruans have a few skills and little education. Pretty much Australian aid is the only thing holding the country together at the moment. So Australian aid ensures that there's fresh water, that there's electricity some of the time, that there's one working hospital, and the police force. Okay, so given this backdrop, and given that I've argued that Australian aid is given on a rather altruistic basis, even if it's not justified on that basis publicly, I've mentioned already that the Pacific solution is over. It finished a few years ago. There are no longer any detainees in Nauru. And yet Australia continues to give the country about $30 million a year. Why? Like the rest of the Pacific, if one were completely and brutally amoral without a shred of human feeling, one could say just on a basis of purely bloodless cost-benefit calculation that whether or not Nauru survives, like most of the rest of the Pacific, makes little difference to Australia's national interest, as I say, conceived of in these completely amoral and hard-nosed terms. Consider a country with no port and only 2 flights a week, a country where everyone knows everyone else, would be a very poor base for foreign terrorists. A country without a financial system imposes obvious limits on would-be money launderers. Not much potential there. There's no danger of Nauruan refugees. First of all, as I mentioned, there are only 9,000 people in the entire country. Secondly, during the glory days of Nauru, any complicated births were flown over to Brisbane. And indeed, many Nauruans in their 30s and up were educated at Australian private schools. So over half the population of Nauru either does have or could have Australian passports. Nauruans remain in Nauru because it's their country and they want to be there. So the stories about bad things that may happen to Australia if we abandon Nauru, and also for much of the rest of the Pacific, are untrue. And yet, despite this, Australia has taken the lead in seeking to nurse the country back to viability. Australia is working to restore some of the phosphate mining. Australia is working to attract a new bank or a branch of an Australian bank. Australia provides much of the law and order, is re-establishing the school system, and 70% of the budget of Nauru is directly provided from Australian aid. The Australian government should be congratulated for their selflessness in providing development aid. And as I say, neither we nor our government should be ashamed about our altruism. Nor should we feel the need to invent benefits or threats just to balance some rather contrived cost-benefit exercise of justifying our foreign aid. Okay, well, so far about Nauru, what's the relevance to the wider Pacific? In some ways, Nauru is obviously singular, given that it's formerly a very wealthy country, as I mentioned on per capita terms, in the 70s and 80s, richer than Australia. And Nauru is particularly small and particularly remote. But still, small size, remoteness, and challenges like dependence on one or a few industries, unemployment, corruption and governance challenges are common to many other Pacific Island nations also. I want to argue in conclusion, though, that there are positive lessons to be drawn from Nauru also. First of all, as I've already mentioned, Nauruans remain in their country despite the hardships and the opportunity that they have to leave. As I say, legally they could catch the next flight out and settle quite happily in Australia. But nevertheless, the vast majority choose to stay. They're quite happy where they are. There is no danger of a wave of Nauruan refugees arriving at Brisbane Airport. Secondly, because of the austerity, the government has introduced a reform policy where almost everyone in the country gets paid almost exactly the same. The pay differential between the highest and the lowest paid is about 2 to 1. As I say, it's taken in the context of very high unemployment as well. And you could probably compare that with some of the activities of, or some of the conduct of financial bailouts that have been extended in the United States and the United Kingdom. In Nauru, the electorate has voted out formerly corrupt leaders, and there's general agreement amongst the population of the country that sweeping, radical and indeed painful changes are required. I also wish to argue that Nauru illustrates the limits of development aid. Despite the huge disparities between Australia and Pacific Islands countries like Nauru, we simply can't spend or pressure our way to the development results that we want, either in Nauru or more broadly in the Pacific. Australia can assist Pacific countries in managing problems, but only where there's widespread popular support in the Pacific countries themselves can these problems really be solved. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.